Welcome to the new video. Today we're going to be talking about D64 files. If you've ever used a Commodore 64 emulator, you've no doubt run across a D64 file before. They're a virtual representation of a physical Commodore 1541 5¼ inch disc. I tried looking into the history of them a little bit, but I didn't spend a bunch of time on it. The first mention I found of a D64 file was in 1993 when Miha Petronel released the C64S Commodore emulator. Now, don't take that to the bank. You might, if you know better, let me know. Maybe somebody created them earlier. But anyway, if you're curious about what's in a D64 file, like what's the file structure, what data from the disk is actually included in the D64, how accurate are they, that's what this video is going to dive into, so stick with me. To understand exactly what is contained within a D64 file, I'll start by explaining how data is stored on a standard Commodore 1541 5¼ inch disk. Let's take a look inside this disk sleeve. When you format a disk, the disk operating system running on the 1541 writes an empty file system structure out to the disk. The disk is laid out into 35 tracks in concentric circles on the disk, with track 1 being the outermost track and track 35 being the innermost track. Track 18 of the disk is special. Commodore's DOS uses sector 0 of track 18 to store things like the name of the disk and the block availability map, or BAM, which it uses to keep track of the remaining free space on the disk. The rest of track 18 is used to store the actual directory entries. Each track is divided into multiple 256-byte sectors. Every track does not contain the same number of sectors. Track 1, being near the outer edge of the disk, can fit more sectors due to having more physical surface area along the circumference of the disk. So track 1 has 21 sectors numbered 0 through 20, while track 35 has 17 sectors numbered 0 through 16. The table on the screen shows how many sectors are in each track. Finally, each sector is divided into a header block and a data block. The header block contains 8 bytes of file system metadata like the track and sector number, and the data block contains up to 256 bytes of the actual data that's being stored. It's important to understand what's stored in the header block and the data block so you'll understand the composition of D64 files when I get to that part. Header blocks and data blocks both are preceded by a sync mark, which is a bit pattern used by the drive to detect the start of either a header block or a data block. The first byte of data is a header block identifier, which is hex 08. This tells the drive it's reading a header block, not a data block. Byte 2 is a checksum of the header block, so the 1541 DOS can confirm there are no read errors when it reads the contents of the header block. The checksum is the exclusive OR of the track number, sector number, and the 2-byte disk ID. Byte 3 is the sector number. Byte 4 is the track number. Bytes 5 and 6 are the 2-byte disk ID that were given to the disk when it was formatted. The disk ID is stored in track 18 sector 0, and it's also stored in the header block of every sector on the disk. Bytes 7 and 8 are hex 0F. They're used as padding bytes. After the 8 bytes of data, there's a header gap that's made up of 8 hex 55 bytes. Now let's look at a data block. The data block is preceded by a sync mark exactly like the one before the header block. The first byte of the data block is the data block identifier, which is hex 07. This tells the drive it's reading a data block, not a header block. The next 256 bytes are the actual data that is stored on disk. This is probably a good time to mention that the 1541 does not store data on disk in ASCII or PETSCII format. Rather, the data is stored on disk in an encoded format called Group Coded Recording, or GCR. After all the data bytes, there's a single byte checksum that is the exclusive OR of all 256 data bytes. Then there are 2 padding bytes, and finally what's called an intersector gap. Now that you know how data is stored on disk by a 1541 disk drive, I'll fire up the Commodore 64 and write a program to disk so we can look at the disk structure. The new Commodore DOS command, abbreviated as N here, is what writes the structure we just talked about to disk. 35 tracks, sectors made up of header and data blocks filling each track, and the special track 18 that contains internal housekeeping information and the directory.
Notice I named this disk Test and gave it a disk ID of XX. Now I can enter a simple basic program, save it to disk, then just be a little bit OCD and load the directory just to make sure it's there. And it is. The Epix FastLoad cartridge has a simple disk editor on it that'll let us look at what was written out. And a quick shout out to Scott Nelson who wrote Epix FastLoad. And if you didn't see my video about how Epix FastLoad works, go check that one out now. The British pound key brings up the FastLoad menu, then E selects the disk editor. I asked FastLoad to read track hex 12, which is 18 in decimal. Recall that track 18 is special. Sector 0 contains the block availability map, which is mostly what you see here. I'm not going into detail about how that works in this video, but if you're curious, let me know in the comments and I can do a follow-up. Only 128 of the 256 bytes of Sector 0 fit on the screen, so I'll cursor down to see the remaining 128 bytes. And down here is where you can see the disk name, test, and disk ID, XX, I provided when I ran the new Commodore DOS command. As I mentioned earlier in the video, those are stored in track 18, sector 0. I'll cursor back up to the first 128 bytes of track 18, sector 0. Recall I said earlier that the directory is also stored in track 18? The first 2 bytes here tell us where the directory entries begin. Track 12 in hex, which again is 18 in decimal, sector 1. Let's check that out. The first 2 bytes here are the track and sector of the next directory block. There's only one file in this directory, so there isn't a next directory block. Commodore DOS uses 0 here to indicate that. The 3rd byte begins the directory entry, and it's where the file type is stored. Hex 82 indicates that this is a program or PRG file. The next 2 bytes are the track and sector where the file data is stored. So our hello program lives at track hex 11, decimal 17, sector 0. Then it's the file name, hello, padded with hex A0 bytes to fill all 16 bytes of the file name. Let's check out track hex 11, sector 0, and we should see our hello basic program stored there. Yep, that looks like our hello basic program. The first 2 bytes are the track and sector of the next block of file data. Hello is a tiny program and it fits in one block, so the 0 track indicates there isn't a next block. The program's load address is next. The start of BASIC on a Commodore 64 is hex 0801, so that's stored here in low byte, high byte order. The next 2 bytes are a pointer to the next line of BASIC. I should note at this point, I'm no longer describing Commodore DOS file system structure. What we're looking at here is the actual tokenized BASIC program data. So 080E points to the next line of BASIC, which ends up being 0 since there is only one line. 0A is the line number 10 I used in my program. 99 is the basic token for the print command. Then you see my quoted hello string. Most of what I showed you in this section of the video isn't necessary for you to understand what's stored in D64 files. I just thought you might find it interesting. Let's take a moment to talk about what the FastLoad disk editor shows us and what it doesn't show us. It's not showing us any of the low-level stuff like the sync marks or the header gap. It's not showing us any of the data from the header block. I mean, sure, the track and sector, but we explicitly asked FastLoad to show us particular track and sectors. We don't see the header checksum, we don't see the header identifier, we don't see the padding bytes. From the data block, it's not showing us any of the metadata like the data block identifier, but it is showing us what's stored in the 256 bytes of data. So FastLoad asked the 1541 to show us specific blocks of data. The DOS ROM in the 1541 spun up the drive, engaged the stepper motor to the track we were asked for, read the header blocks until it found the correct sector, read the data block, did GCR decoding, and then FastLoad presented us with the decoded Petsky data bytes. All of that stuff happened behind the scenes and is completely hidden from us when we're viewing this in the FastLoad disk editor. Great, we understand that, so now let's convert this physical disk into a D64 file so we can see what's stored in the D64. The setup I'll be using is a 2015 MacBook Pro running Ubuntu. Hardware-wise, I'm using a Zoom floppy device. These were created by Nate Lawson. Thank you, Nate. And you can purchase them from Jim Brain's Go4 Retro webshop. Jim is a great fellow, highly recommended. Now, all you do, connect the serial cable from the back of the 1541 disk drive to the connector on Zoom floppy. Then you power the Zoom floppy board using USB. Software-wise, I'm using the D64 copy command from the OpenCBM command suite. The folks who create and maintain these utilities are just wonderful. Their work makes so much of what I do possible. So thank you guys, everyone mentioned on this site, you rock. As for D64 copy syntax, it doesn't get much easier. The device I want to copy from, and the D64 file name I want to save. Great, now I can use hexdump to look at the contents of the D64 file. And what we find out is that a D64 is incredibly simple. What is stored is exactly what Epic's fast load showed us in the disk editor, which is why I went the route of showing you that first. None of the low-level stuff is stored in the D64. No header block information, no GCR encoded data, none of that. It's just the data bytes from the data block in a flat file already GCR decoded for us. So given this, using some simple math, we should be able to find track 18 here. There are 256 bytes per sector, and in tracks 1 through 17, there are 21 sectors per track. So multiply 256 by 21 by 17, and you get 91,392. Converted to hex, that's 16500. So the byte offset for the start of track 18 will be hex 16500. I'll search for that to confirm. That's it, man. That's track 18. Super cool. So let's do some side-by-side action of Epic's Fastload's disk editor and compare that to what we see in the hex dump of the D64 file, both on track 18 sector 0. They're identical. So a D64 file is just a flat dump of every data byte from the 1541 disk. There's nothing more to it. Using the same math, we can calculate the byte offset of where our hello file is stored in the D64. Recall it's in track 17, sector 0. And that's an offset of hex 15000. Side by side with our Epic's fast load output of track 17 or 11 hex, sector 0, and you can see the output is again identical. That is our Hello World basic program.
All right, let's wrap it up here. What have we learned? Well, a D64 file contains every data byte from the source disk and only the data bytes. There is no other information from that source disk like track and sector information or anything other than the data bytes. We don't get GCR data, we don't get track and sector information. Now, obviously, an emulator looking at a D64 can very easily calculate track and sector data based on doing the simple math I showed you looking at byte offsets within the file, but it's key to note that the data of track and sector information is not stored in a D64. So what are D64s good for? Well, they're good for almost everything. I mean, if you're using an emulator, you've noticed that you're chugging away every day and most everything just works on a D64. The two biggest limitations I can think of right off the bat both have to do with the stepper motor in the Commodore 1541 disk drive. The first thing is Commodore made the decision to format their disks as 35 tracks, Well, the stepper motor can actually position itself to more than double 35, so it can be positioned in between two tracks. If you've ever heard the term half tracks, that's what it's talking about. Some commercial software actually used half tracks as a form of copy protection, so that can't be represented in a D64 file. There's no notion of half tracks. It's only track 1 through 35. The other one is also related to the stepper motor. It's the fact that you can actually format on a Commodore 64 or a 1541 beyond track 35. I think you can format out to track 40 if I recall correctly. That isn't going to be represented in D64. Now, it's also key to note there were a bunch of variations of the D64 over the years. Like I said, the thing came out, in 93? It's 2024 now, so there have been variations where people have extended them. There's a variation of D64 that has an error table at the end of it. So if there were disk errors, it will mention which blocks had errors and things like that. Also, I believe there was a version of the D64 that can do 40 tracks. So it's not hard and fast that D64 doesn't work with only 35 tracks. Anyway, I hope you found this video interesting. If you have questions, drop them in the comments. I'll see you next time.